April 18th, 1942. It's just past 3 a.m. on the USS Hornet, somewhere in the cold, churning North Pacific. The lookout's voice cuts through the static on the bridge phone. Surface contact, bearing Aero Juentidigar, about 12,000 yards out. Lieutenant Commander Frank Akers pulls down his binoculars and grabs the intercom. The Japanese picket boat Nitomaru has spotted them. Just like that, the 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers strapped to the Hornet's wooden flight deck are in the spotlight. Nobody here knows it yet, but this run-in will set off the first American bombing raid on Japan itself, a mission so wild even its architects called it a suicide run. Out on deck, dawn breaks ugly. Waves crash over the bow, winds howl near 40 knots, and rain slashes visibility down to less than 5 miles. These aren't the conditions Doolittle trained for back at Eglin Field. They're still 650 nautical miles from Japan, 250 more than they planned. The numbers aren't pretty. Each B-25's loaded with 1,141 gallons of fuel. If everything goes right, they'll just make it to China. Pearl Harbor changed the way American planners thought about war. Geography doesn't make you safe anymore. If Japanese carriers could hit Hawaii out of nowhere, then Japan's home islands weren't untouchable either. The logic was simple: hit Japan, break the myth of invincibility that fired up their expansion across the Pacific. After December 7th, President Roosevelt wanted payback fast. Not in 6 months, not after factories kicked into high gear, but now, with American sailors still drifting in the oily water at Pearl Harbor and Japanese troops rolling over the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The country needed to see that America could hit back. Admiral Ernest King, head of naval operations, saw what it meant. Japan's defensive line stretched from the Kurils to the Dutch East Indies, a wall of islands and bases it would take years to crack. But behind that line, the Japanese islands stood safe. At least, they thought so. They figured no American bomber could reach Tokyo from any base in the Pacific. Then along came Captain Francis Lowe. On January 10, 1942, he watched Army Air Force bombers practicing carrier takeoffs at Norfolk's Chambers Field, the runway painted like a carrier deck. Twin-engine bombers launching from a flat top. It broke every rule in the Navy's book, but Lowe's idea flipped the script. The Hornet itself was a beast, nearly 20,000 tons standard, over 25,000 fully loaded. Flight deck stretched 809 feet, 86 feet across. 4 Parsons steam turbines pumped out 120,000 horsepower, shoving her through the Pacific at 32.5 knots. Captain Mark Mitcher commanded almost 3,000 men. This time, though, there were no Navy planes on board, just 16 Army B-25B Mitchell bombers, filling every inch of deck. Leading the raid, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle barely topped 5'4", but in aviation circles he was a giant. MIT doctorate in aeronautical engineering, winner of the Schneider, Thompson, and Bendix trophies, first to pull off an outside loop, first to fly coast to coast in less than 24 hours, first to take off, fly, and land by instruments alone. At 45, he'd logged more hours in experimental cockpits than most pilots managed in a lifetime. The B-25B Mitchell was a product of American know-how. Wingspan nearly 68 feet, length just over 53. Empty, she weighed in at 21,100 pounds. 2 Cyclone engines, each cranking out 1,700 horsepower. Standard range, 1,350 miles with a 3,000-pound bomb load. But Standard didn't cut it for this job. North American Aviation's engineers stripped the lower gun turret, saved 600 pounds, less drag, more fuel efficiency. They crammed extra tanks into the bomb bay, crawlway, and turret space, pushing fuel capacity from 646 gallons to 1,141. The top-secret Norden bomb sight got swapped for a homemade gadget, a 20-cent rig dreamed up by Captain Charles Greening, built from hardware store scraps. Every detail mattered. Normally, a carrier takeoff needed 500 feet of deck. The B-25s had just 467 to work with. They'd need every bit of wind the Pacific could throw at them, over 40 knots across the deck, to get airborne at all. Each bomber tipped the scales at 31,000 pounds. When fully loaded, almost double the weight of the Navy's biggest carrier planes. No Army bomber had ever taken off from a carrier in combat before, and no medium bomber had flown a mission this long, 2,400 miles over open water, without fighter cover. Back in April 1942, Japan's homeland defenses stood on 3 years of planning and complete confidence. The Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the Western Pacific, from the Aleutians all the way down to Australia. Land-based aircraft covered the gaps with overlapping patrols from island bases. Submarines watched the approaches to the home islands, but their first line of defense wasn't high-tech. It was a wall of picket boats, old fishing vessels really, spaced every 50 miles, stretching 600 to 700 miles out from the coast. Each boat had a radio strong enough to get a warning back to headquarters in Tokyo. One of those boats, the Nito Maru, was officially a 70-ton patrol vessel, but really just a fishing boat with 11 men and 1 machine gun. Her job was simple: not support American ships, send their position, and hope to survive. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, he led the first air fleet at Pearl Harbor, believed American carriers couldn't get within 600 miles of Japan without getting caught. His 6 big carriers had already shown at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Ceylon that carrier aviation could tip the balance in naval warfare. The nearest American bases that could launch heavy bombers were in the Aleutians, over 2,000 miles from Tokyo. The B-17s in Australia sat 3,000 miles away. When you did the math for fuel and bomb load, a normal bombing run just didn't add up. General Hideki Tojo, both Prime Minister and War Minister, told Emperor Hirohito that the divine winds that once saved Japan from the Mongols would protect them again. The Japanese public believed their islands were wrapped in an unbreakable shield. Enemy planes, they were told, would never touch their skies. That blind certainty set the stage for the Doolittle Raid's shock. Psychologically, it hit harder than the bombs. At 3:10 a.m. on April 18th, the radar operator on the USS Enterprise picked up a surface contact bearing 028 degree, 21,000 yards out, moving southwest at 9 knots right across Task Force 16's path. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding from Enterprise, had to make a snap choice: push on to the planned launch spot and risk discovery, or launch now from a less than ideal distance. By 5:30 a.m., the Japanese picket boat Nito Maru had spotted the American task force. Seaman First Class Nakamura radioed in, 3 enemy carriers sighted, 650 nautical miles east of Inubasaki, heading west at 20 knots. Static garbled the message, but enough got through to Tokyo to trigger alarms. At 5:38, the USS Nashville opened fire. Her 6-inch guns bracketed the picket boat with the second volley. Nito Maru went up in flames and sank within minutes, but she'd already sent her warning. Halsey had no choice left. Launch now or call it off. At 6:20, he signaled the Hornet, launch planes. To Colonel Doolittle and his men, he sent, good luck and God bless you. Doolittle's B-25, tail number 40-22344, sat 467 feet from the bow. Navy launch officer Lieutenant Henry Miller waited on the port side, timing the carrier's pitch in the 30-foot swells. When the bow hit the bottom of a trough, Miller spun his checkered flag, a sign to push throttles to the stops. Flight engineer Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard kept his eyes on the engine gauges as the cylinder temps crept to the red. Co-pilot Lieutenant Richard Cole called out the airspeed: 40 knots, 50, 60. The deck's white edge rushed toward them. At 8:20, with less than 50 feet left, Doolittle pulled back on the yoke. The B-25 lurched off the deck, dipped toward the waves as it lost the carrier's wind, then clawed skyward into the gray Pacific morning. 15 more bombers followed, each 4 minutes apart. Lieutenant Travis Hoover barely cleared the deck with just 10 feet to spare. Lieutenant Robert Gray's bomber dropped so low after takeoff that the tail gunner got soaked by spray. Captain David Jones watched green water splash over his windshield before the plane finally started climbing. Every pilot pulled off a small miracle, getting those overloaded bombers off a pitching deck into gale-force winds. The 16 B-25s set off for Japan, flying solo, hugging the waves and keeping radio silence, doing everything they could to slip past the enemy's radar. They navigated by dead reckoning, compass and drift meter. No radio beacons, no weather updates, no fighter escort. Just 5 men in each plane, alone over 650 miles of hostile ocean. Doolittle's bomber hit the Japanese coast at 12:30 p.m. local time. Lieutenant Henry Potter, the navigator, figured their position to within 5 miles, even though they'd flown through rain and shifting winds. Down below, Japanese civilians waved from fishing boats. They probably thought the low-flying bomber was just another Japanese patrol. The fake gun barrels in the tail did their job. Nobody suspected a thing. Tokyo's air raid warning went off at 9 a.m. because of a report from the Nitamaru, but by noon, with no enemy in sight, they called it off. Life in the city, all 6.5 million people carried on like any regular Saturday. At 1:15 p.m., Doolittle's bombardier, Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer, opened the bomb bay doors. 4 500-pound incendiary clusters dropped from maybe 200 feet, spreading fire across 10 city blocks in Cheetah. 30 seconds later, Lieutenant Travis Hoover's crew hit the Tokyo Special Steel Company. The powder works went up in a huge pillar of flame you could see for miles. Lieutenant Robert Gray bombed the Tokyo Gas and Electric Facility. Lieutenant Everett Holstrom hit the Agura Oil Company refinery. Captain David Jones dropped his bombs on military warehouses in Yokohama. Each crew had a target folder, but the weather, navigation errors, and anti-aircraft fire forced them to improvise. The second wave reached Japan between 1 and 2 p.m. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, flying the Green Hornet, bombed Yokohama's steel mills even as anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Lieutenant Ted Lawson hit the Nippon Machinery Works. Lieutenant Harold Watson struck the Tokyo Naval Arsenal. Lieutenant Richard Joyce targeted the Japan Special Steel Company. Everyone reported successful bomb runs, but nobody could stick around to see the damage. They had to make a run for China, engines roaring. Captain Edward York's B-25 started guzzling fuel, the left engine burning twice as much as normal. 200 miles from Japan, he realized they wouldn't make it to China. York turned northwest, landing in Soviet territory after a 6-hour flight to Vladivostok. The Soviets pretended the crew wasn't there but kept them safe for the next 14 months. One of those diplomatic headaches everyone pretends doesn't exist. Meanwhile, Lieutenant William Farrow's bomber reached Nagoya just as Japanese fighters scrambled from Kasumigara Naval Air Station. 9 Mitsubishi A6M0s chased his B-25, but flying low and fast kept the bombers ahead. Corporal Jacob Deeser released 4 incendiary clusters over the Mitsubishi aircraft plant, burned out the paint shop, damaged the assembly building. With each explosion, the shock spread. Tokyo hadn't heard air raid sirens since the Kanto earthquake in 1923. Kids ran from schools. Office workers flooded the streets. Prime Minister Tojo, inspecting bases during the raid, actually saw a B-25 fly so close he could spot the pilot, though the American never fired at him. The raid shattered the myth of Japan's safety. As the B-25s turned for China, fuel gauges dropped faster than anyone expected. Headwinds over 25 knots, fuel burn way over the worst case. The Chinese airfield at Chuchao, supposed to be ready with homing beacons and runway lights, was dark and silent. No radio answers. The crews had to choose bail out over unknown land or try to ditch in the dark. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's B-25 hit the ocean at 110 Farrow, trying to ditch. The impact snapped the plane in half, threw Lawson through the windscreen. He broke his left leg, gashed his face, lost teeth. Navigator Charles McClure dragged him out of the sinking wreck. Gunner David Thatcher dove back into the flooded fuselage over and over, hauling out equipment and medical kits. Chinese forces hadn't been told about the raid. Security and communication failures kept them in the dark. General Chiang Kai-shek only found out when bombers started landing in China. Chinese gunners, thinking the B-25s were Japanese, opened fire. Lieutenant Donald Smith's plane took hits near Nanchang, forcing the crew to bail out over Japanese-occupied territory. Meanwhile, the weather over China kept getting worse after sunset. Clouds dropped to 500 feet. Visibility shrank to less than a mile. Mountains climbed to 6,000 feet along their route home. Flying blind, with no radio beacons or decent maps, crews had nothing but gut instinct and luck. Running out of fuel wasn't just a risk, it was a guarantee. Gauges dipped toward empty somewhere between 2,200 and 2,400 hours. When both engines finally sputtered out, Lieutenant Harold Watson told his crew to jump at 11,000 feet. They scattered over 20 miles of rugged mountains in Jiang Province. Watson's parachute snagged in a tree, leaving him dangling 30 feet up, shivering and soaked in freezing rain. He hung there for 6 hours, yelling for help until a few Chinese farmers finally heard him and cut him down. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's crew was among the last to test if the mission had any shot at success. After hitting Yokohama, Hallmark steered the Green Hornet west, hoping to reach China before night swallowed them. Navigator Lieutenant Chase Nielsen figured they'd cross the coast, but there was nothing, no airfields, just darkness. Both engines were running on fumes. At 11:45 p.m., Hallmark gave the order, "Get ready to crash." The B-25 slammed into the water near China with brutal force. Hallmark smashed his head on the instrument panel. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Robert Marr, blacked out. Bombardier Staff Sergeant William Dieter and Engineer Corporal Donald Fitzmaurice drowned as the plane sank. Nielsen managed to escape through the broken canopy, dragging Hallmark and Maida to shore. Lieutenant William Farrow's crew fared no better. After bombing Nagoya, their bomber ran dry over China. They bailed out into pitch-black night at 8,000 feet. Bombardier Corporal Jacob Deesa landed in a rice paddy, one used as a toilet basically. Covered in filth, lost, and unable to speak the language, Deesa wandered for hours before a Japanese patrol grabbed him. He spent the next 40 months alone in a cell, tortured again and again for information about American carriers. Farrow and Navigator Lieutenant George Barr were picked up within hours. Engineer Sergeant Harold Spatz was beaten unconscious by Japanese soldiers who found him hiding in a Buddhist temple. Co-pilot Lieutenant Robert Height was caught while trying to get help from Chinese villagers, people who were threatened with death if they dared help American airmen. The Japanese response? Swift, ruthless. Emperor Hirohito himself ordered that captured airmen be executed as war criminals. Since the Doolittle Raiders hadn't worn uniforms during the raid, they were technically considered spies. 8 captured men went through sham trials in Shanghai. Lieutenants Farrow and Hallmark, along with Sergeant Spatz, were executed by firing squad on October 15th, 1942. The other 5 got life sentences. In the end, 69 of the 80 Doolittle Raiders reached safety in free China. 3 died in crash landings or drowned. 8 fell into Japanese hands. One crew ended up interned in the Soviet Union. Not a single B-25 made it home. Every bomber was lost, crashed, destroyed, or abandoned so the Japanese couldn't get them. Japan's physical damage? Honestly, it was light. 50 killed, 252 wounded, 112 buildings hit. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle stood in a Chinese rice field, staring at the wreck of his bomber, and told his crew he expected to be court-martialed. "I've lost all 16 planes. This was supposed to boost morale, and all I've done is prove bombers can't fly from carriers." His engineer, Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard, just shook his head and said, "Colonel, you've just won the Medal of Honor." The raid's real impact landed squarely on Japanese strategy. Admiral Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the fleet, was eating breakfast when he heard the news. He sat in silence for half an hour, then gave the orders that led straight to Japan's first major defeat. The Midway operation, something the naval staff hadn't even planned to do, got the green light on the spot. Yamamoto wanted the American carriers destroyed no matter what. Back in the U.S., President Roosevelt played coy. When reporters asked where the bombers had launched from, he just grinned and said, "Shangri-La," dropping a nod to the mythical paradise from James Hilton's novel. Americans, battered by months of bad news, finally had something to cheer for. War bond sales jumped 20% that week. The Doolittle Raid's strategic shockwaves went way beyond physical damage. 4 Japanese Army fighter groups were pulled home from the Southwest Pacific. Squadrons badly needed in New Guinea and the Solomons, where their absence helped tip the scales at Coral Sea and Guadalcanal. The Navy rushed the Midway operation, shaving 6 weeks off their schedule and leaving themselves no time to get ready. The Chinese paid a brutal price for America's success. When Doolittle's crews landed in Jiang and Jiangxi provinces, the Japanese lashed out with Operation Seago. General Shunroku Hata sent in 100,000 troops and told them to wipe out anyone who helped the Americans. Villages went up in flames. Wells got poisoned with cholera and typhoid. About 250,000 Chinese civilians died in just 3 months. It was murder on an unbelievable scale, but the raid changed how Americans bombed. Flying low actually worked, so they started using skip bombing, which tore up Japanese shipping. The B-25's performance inspired new, tougher versions, strafer models loaded with guns, even 75mm cannons up front. North American engineers turned these bombers into flying artillery. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto became obsessed with wiping out American carriers. That obsession set the stage for Midway. On June 4th, 1942, the Japanese sent 4 fleet carriers, sure they'd crush the Americans. But U.S. codebreakers figured out the plan. They moved 3 carriers into position, ready to strike. In just 5 minutes, dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown took out 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The 4th, Hiryu, went down a few hours later, losing 4 carriers and all those experienced pilots was a blow the Japanese Navy never recovered from. They could build new ships slowly, but those pilots were gone for good. The balance of power at sea shifted for good, and it all traced back to those 16 B-25s flying off the Hornet on a stormy April morning. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle got the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt at the White House on May 19, 1942. He skipped the rank of colonel, jumped straight to brigadier general, and went on to lead the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th in the Mediterranean, and finally the 8th in England. Every man on the raid earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. The Chinese government gave them the Order of the Cloud and Banner. The human cost echoed for decades. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's memoir, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, became a hit book and then a Hollywood movie. Corporal Jacob DeShazer spent 40 months as a Japanese prisoner, then returned to Japan after the war as a missionary and ended up converting one of his former guards. Lieutenant Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, lived to 103, passing away in 2019 as the last of the Doolittle Raiders. The technical side of the raid didn't fade either. Carrier-based aviation changed from just defending the fleet to projecting power. Army and Navy working together, radical in 1942, became the norm. Special ops that needed extreme range and little support could trace their roots right back to those 16 bombers taking off on a mission everyone thought was impossible. Japanese historians later called the Doolittle Raid the real turning point of the Pacific War, not Pearl Harbor that just fired up Japanese confidence. Not even Midway, which was still 2 months away. The real shock came when American bombers showed up over Tokyo, making it clear that Japan's ocean defenses meant nothing now. The fate of the captured Doolittle Raiders haunted Japanese commanders. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, barely able to stand from his wounds, walked to his execution with dignity. At 4:30 p.m. on October 15, 1942, at Public Cemetery No. 1, outside Shanghai, Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz were tied to crosses, blindfolded, given a moment for prayer, and then shot. The Japanese cremated their bodies, which they considered the ultimate insult. Lieutenant Robert Meader, Hallmark's co-pilot, survived the crash but died in captivity on December 1, 1943, from malnutrition and dysentery. The other prisoners, Nielsen, Haidt, Barr, and DeShazer, endured 3.5 years of torture, starvation, and solitary confinement before liberation. In August 1945, they survived thanks to each other, a smuggled Bible, and stubborn determination. Even looking back, the numbers are staggering. 16 bombers, each weighing 31,000 pounds, launched from a carrier deck in 40-knot winds and 30-foot seas. They flew 650 miles to hit targets they'd never seen, navigating mostly by compass and gut feeling. They dropped 64,000 pounds of bombs on 5 Japanese cities in broad daylight, then flew another 1,500 miles, hoping to land somewhere in the dark over unknown country. The USS Hornet only lasted another 6 months after launching the Doolittle Raiders. Japanese forces sank her at the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands on October 26, 1942. She went down with 140 aircraft and 111 crew, all swallowed by the Pacific. But her place in history was already set. That April, when 16th Army bombers pulled off what Japan's military said couldn't be done. The Doolittle Raid wasn't just another mission. It showed that sheer creativity could outmatch bigger numbers, that guts could fill in for missing resources. 16 planes rewrote the rules and tipped the balance in the world's biggest war. The raid sent a clear message. Japan learned its home islands weren't untouchable. Americans learned they could win. Both sides carried those lessons forward, shaping the brutal march toward Tokyo Bay and eventually surrender. In the National Museum of the United States Air Force, there's a battered piece of aluminum with the serial number 42267. It's all that's left of Lieutenant Edgar McRoy's B-25, hauled off a Chinese mountainside in 1962. The metal's scarred and weather-beaten, but when experts studied it, they found traces of Tokyo factory smoke still clinging to the surface. It's proof, right down to the molecules, that heavy bombers really did launch from a carrier and change history's course. Years later, the true weight of the Doolittle Raid came from a surprising place. In 1959, Prince Takamatsu, Emperor Hirohito's brother, showed up at a reunion of the Raiders in Tucson, Arizona. Someone asked why he'd come so far. He said, "Your 16 planes changed our world. They proved that courage and innovation could defeat tradition and expectation. The bombs you dropped on Tokyo were small. The ideas you dropped were devastating. Every carrier aircraft launching from American decks today carries the legacy of April 18th, 1942. Every joint service operation follows the example set when Army, Air Forces, and Navy crews proved that service lines disappear when survival's on the line. The Doolittle Raid didn't win the Pacific War outright, but it proved the Allies could win. Those 16 B-25s from the Hornet carried more than bombs. They carried a wounded nation's determination. They carried a promise. Geography couldn't shield the enemy. They carried the future of carrier aviation and special operations. Most of all, they proved that in modern war, the impossible just takes a little extra effort, and the difficult is just another Tuesday.